In the course of naval history, there are many ships that went largely unknown, at least in their day and age. This could be because they were just one of many in their class, such as most Fletchers, or because they were overshadowed by more famous ships when they were sunk. Regardless of the reason, this applies to more than a few ships. However, some of those forgotten ships saw a second life in the internet age, often because of memes of some form or another. And today's video is most assuredly one of those cases. The Japanese destroyer Yūdachi. If you've played World of Warships for any stretch of time, well, you know what I mean. Yudachi is an interesting case. For most of the 20th century, this ship was largely ignored. If anyone cared about Japanese destroyers, they'd probably be looking at Yukikaze or Shigure. If even that. Yudachi? Probably not. However, in the last decade or so, that has definitely changed. Ignoring the more obvious memes for the moment, the ship picked up a second life as the Nightmare of Solomon. How much of that is just a meme is debated as well. Yudachi certainly fought hard, but I haven't seen much reference to that nickname in proper historical sources. Not in direct relation to this ship at any rate. Another example of how much internet memes can shape popular imagination. In this video, we'll be peeling things back a bit and looking at Yudachi the ship, not Yudachi the meme, because her history is interesting enough on its own and doesn't really require fluffing up. Especially her final battle where, dubious nicknames aside, the ship fought very hard. That said, we do need to look at where she began first, which in this case was on October 16th, 1934. Yudachi was laid down where the ship would have a fairly typical peacetime construction. She would be launched on June 21st, 1936, about a year and a half after the keel was laid, with the ship commissioned about half a year later on January 7th of 1937. Not really slow, but definitely not the breakneck pace of wartime construction. In this, she was right in line with her Shiratsuyu-class sisters, which is a good point to detour to that design before we move on. These ships were, in simplest terms, an iterative improvement on their predecessor, the Hatsuharu class, which suffered from serious topweight issues. The final 6 members were reordered to address this problem, with the major difference being a lower and more compact bridge structure. The funnels were also slightly different. Not a major difference, but you'd be surprised how much just lowering the bridge can help with stability. The ships also carried a different torpedo loadout, but we'll get to that later on. Before then, we'll start with displacement. In this regard, Yudachi displaced around 1,700 tons at her standard loading, with this going up to just under 2,000 tons when fully loaded. On that displacement, the ship carried a fairly typical loadout for a Japanese destroyer, this being the same 127mm 5-inch gun pioneered on Fubuki. Most Japanese destroyers went for 6 of those weapons, in 3 twin mounts. Shiratsuyu, on the other hand, carried 5 127mm guns, 1 twin mount on the bow and another on the stern, with a single mount just ahead of the stern twin, with that mount removed later in the war on the surviving ships to make way for more 25mm guns. Regardless, those 5 127mm guns were supported by a heavy torpedo broadside. Shiratsuyu was the first Japanese design to carry quad torpedo mounts. In this case, two mounts carried amidships for 8 torpedoes. Each tube had a single reload for 16 torpedoes in all, with the weaponry rounded off beyond this point by depth charges on the stern, as well as the usual 25mm anti-aircraft guns, the exact number varying on ship and time period, as is often the case. Which brings us to speed to round things off, which in this case came out to 34 knots on 42,000 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. Relatively pedestrian by the standards of Japanese destroyers, but not at all slow in more general terms. Either way, that wraps things up for now. Now back to Yudachi's story, where we left off on her commissioning. As I said, this came on January 7th, 1937, at which point details on her service unfortunately dry up. Although this is not particularly surprising. Japan had a lot of destroyers, and the late 1930s was a largely uneventful period. Japan was at war with China, yes, but other than gunfire support or transport runs, there was little for destroyers to do. The Chinese fleet, such as it was, would be neutralized early on. Not much to use those fancy torpedoes on. As a result, even combined fleet doesn't touch on Yudachi at all between her commissioning and late 1941. Yudachi most likely spent the period between 1937 and late 1941 on typical Japanese duty for the time, escorting the battleships and carriers off of China, providing gunfire support to troops at places like Shanghai, or transporting troops between Japan and China. This is the most likely answer based on other Japanese ships. That said, firm details on her service do return as we hit 1941, or at least late 1941, specifically for combined fleet late November. Yudachi was serving with Destroyer Division 2 as they sailed to join the Philippine invasion force, with this division made up of 4 Shiratsuyu-class destroyers. Yudachi herself, alongside Murasame, Harusame, and Samidare. All 4 set sail on November 26, 1941, with the squadron joining the invasion force on December 7, 1941. For the rest of the year, into early 1942, Yudachi would bounce around supporting various invasions. First the Philippines, as noted, then the East Indies from Tarakan on January 12, 1942, to Borneo on January 23rd, and then on to Java on February 27th, with this particular one being notable because it led into the Battle of the Java Sea, where Yudachi would engage the Allied formation, though her role was fairly minimal, at least for this battle. She would get her chance to shine much later in 1942. For the moment, Yudachi would move on. After Java Sea came to its end, the destroyer continued to support various operations. From March through April 1942, this primarily involved the Philippines. By the end of April, though, the ship was in desperate need of an overhaul. While Yudachi had avoided any sort of damage, the ship had been at war for months, almost half a year. Any ship would need a break in dock after that, and Yudachi was no exception. As such, she was sent back to Japan in early May 1942, arriving back home on May 6th for a refit that lasted the rest of the month, at the conclusion of which the destroyer returned to her support role, this time not in the South Pacific. Yudachi was instead assigned to escort the occupation force for the Battle of Midway. As you can probably guess from that statement, she would largely miss Midway itself. Yudachi was quite a ways back from the main battle where the Kido Butai was mauled. On the one hand, she avoided damage. On the other, she also missed out on the battle. Either way, with Midway a painful failure, Yudachi turned back for Japan. Her next planned operation wouldn't come until July, when the destroyer moved to Singapore. She left Kure on July 16th and arrived in Singapore later that month. Once in Singapore, the destroyer was assigned to a planned Indian Ocean raid. I say planned because this would not materialize. As the Japanese prepared the operation, events in the Solomons rendered it moot. The American invasion of Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, was a problem. The Japanese had to reroute forces to try and contest this operation. And while battles like Savo Island were a success, the Japanese were still suffering losses. Yudachi would, as such, be transferred. She arrived at Shortland Island on August 30th to take up transport duty. The famous Tokyo Express runs, where destroyers snuck in at high speed during the night to avoid American airstrikes or surface forces. For most of September, this would be Yudachi's role, either directly transporting supplies and men or escorting other ships doing the same, with one major exception at the start of the month. On the night of September 5th, Yudachi, along with Hatsuyuki and Murakumo, engaged two American transports. Old Wicks-class destroyers converted to fast troop ships. This would have been a lopsided match against fully kitted out Wicks-class destroyers. Those were old and lightly armed by Second World War standards. However, the transports, Little and Gregory, were even less fit for a gunfight. Their conversion to transports had seen half of their boilers removed, along with much of their weaponry. The ships were slower and even less fit for a fight against modern Japanese destroyers. The result is perhaps predictable. Gregory and Little were on patrol duty the night of September 5th, 1942, during which they spotted flashes of gunfire on the horizon. The first assumption was a submarine, but radar soon confirmed that wasn't the case. This was actually the three Japanese destroyers in the middle of bombarding Guadalcanal. At this point, the two transports should have pulled back. Unfortunately, a PBY pilot, also assuming it was a submarine, dropped flares, almost on top of the American destroyers. The Japanese couldn't have asked for a better target. Within 3 minutes, Gregory was a flaming wreck. Little lasted longer, able to open fire with her remaining guns. Even so, she was crippled and sinking within 15 minutes. At this point, the Japanese ships, they shifted fire from the flaming wrecks to the men in the water instead, before eventually moving on, with Yudachi claiming credit for both of the sinkings. Following this, the rest of September and most of October was spent on transport duty, along with the odd shore bombardment. Yudachi was also part of the support force during the Battle of Santa Cruz, but much like Midway, this was primarily focused on the carriers. Yudachi had little to do during that action on October 26, 1942. Instead, her next and final engagement came on the night of November 12, 1942. Or rather, into the very early morning of November 13th. Yudachi, in the lead of her squadron of destroyers, encountered the Americans at 1:42 a.m. on November 13th. This would see the destroyer sail past her American counterparts, led by USS Cushing. Neither side engaged the other at first. The Americans, due to indecisive orders, and the Japanese, due to caution. Yudachi actually got a bit lost trying to find the rest of the Japanese formation, at least until the actual battle kicked off. This action, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, was a chaotic mess. Ships firing in every direction, torpedoes blasting both sides, and of course, things like USS Laffey charging the battleship Hiei. For Yudachi, she would end up in the thick of it, at points surrounded by American ships, fired upon by anything from cruisers to destroyers. Reports of the battle seem to indicate this destroyer being everywhere at some point or another. She was fired upon by USS San Francisco, and she might have torpedoed Juneau and USS Portland. Moreover, Yudachi may even have charged into the thick of things to try and relieve pressure on Hiei. Certainly, citing O'Hara, Yudachi ended up between Juneau and Aaron Ward at one point, nearly causing those two to collide. Depending on how much you trust the chaotic reports, Yudachi might well have engaged most of the American formation, at some point or another. What is clear, though, is that she was finally disabled towards the end of the battle. Even here, however, reports differ. It might have been gunfire from USS Aaron Ward. It might have been friendly fire from Asaguma. It might have been torpedoes from USS Sterett, or gunfire from Sterett. Yudachi's fate is a perfect example of just how much of a mess that battle was. For what it's worth, Aaron Ward's crew seem to have been fairly certain they did the deed. Regardless, no one can quite agree on who dealt the crippling blow. Yudachi was still left a flaming wreck. Crippled and beyond saving, the crew was taken off by her sister Samidare. 207 men were taken aboard, with 26 lost in the battle. Her sister tried to scuttle Yudachi, but this failed, with the destroyer ultimately still afloat as the sun came up, only to be sunk by the cruiser she might have torpedoed, USS Portland, which had been stuck sailing in a circle. There's conflicting reports even here. Some say Yudachi was sunk in spite of flying a white flag. Others say the white flag was an impromptu sail put up before the ship was abandoned. And still others say this is a myth and there was no white flag or sail at all. Yet another contradictory thing about this ship. All we can say for absolute certain is that Yudachi sank on November 13th, 1942. With her wreck eventually located by Robert Ballard in 1992. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.